London, June 1942. Major General Dwight Eisenhower stepped down from the train at Paddington Station into a city that looked as if it had been used as a target for artillery drills. The station's vast glass roof was torn open in places, its gaps crudely patched with tarpaulins. Nearby entire blocks were nothing but rubble and weeds. 2 years after the bombs had fallen, a red double-decker bus rolled past, its windows boarded over with sheets of plywood. People moved along the pavements with quiet determination, dressed in threadbare coats, faces lean from long months of rationing. They glanced at Eisenhower's crisp American uniform with something that might have been curiosity, or might have been nothing at all. They had seen far too much to be impressed by a general's stars. Eisenhower had come to assume command of American forces in Europe, tasked with building the alliance that would one day invade Hitler's fortress Europe. He had read the reports, studied the maps, memorized the figures. None of it prepared him for the physical reality of a nation that had been fighting alone for 2 years. Every building told a story. Every face carried weight. This was not the Britain of pomp and ceremony he had imagined. This was something tougher, something shaped by fire, something that would not break. He would later write that he expected to find a country on the brink of collapse, exhausted, desperate for American rescue. Instead, he found a people who had stared into the abyss and decided to spit back at it. 2 years earlier, in June 1940, Britain had faced the most desperate moment in its 1,000-year history. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind nearly all of its heavy equipment. Norway was lost. The Low Countries were lost. The Channel Islands would fall within days. Every major European power, except neutral Switzerland and Sweden, was now either conquered by Nazi Germany or allied with it. The Soviet Union was bound to Hitler by a non-aggression pact. America remained firmly neutral, separated by an ocean and public opinion. Britain and its empire stood alone against a German war machine that had just proven it could crush the combined armies of France, Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands in 46 days. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister for barely a month, addressed Parliament on June 4th. The speech would become famous for its defiance, but the reality he described was catastrophic. 30,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in France. Thousands of tons of ammunition abandoned, 1,000 guns gone, all the army's tanks and transport vehicles left behind on the beaches. Britain now faced the prospect of invasion with a battered army, only a handful of divisions, and a coastline impossible to defend in full. German generals were already preparing Operation Sea Lion. They had 4 million men under arms, 3,000 tanks, and control of the European coastline from Norway to Spain. The Luftwaffe fielded more than 3,000 aircraft. Britain's Royal Air Force had fewer than 700 operational fighters. The mathematics were merciless. In Washington, American military planners gave Britain 3 weeks, perhaps 6, if luck held. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, watching from London, sent cables insisting British defeat was inevitable and warning America not to tie its future to a sinking ship. He was not alone in that view. Most of the world expected Britain to seek terms, to reach some accommodation with Hitler that might preserve the empire and spare the island invasion. The British government did not seek terms. Instead, it prepared to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, and in the streets. Road signs were removed to confuse invaders. Pillboxes and anti-tank obstacles were built. The Home Guard was armed with whatever could be found: shotguns, improvised weapons, even pikes. Churchill told his ministers that if the island were invaded, the government would move to Canada and continue the war. The Royal Navy would sail to the Empire. Britain might fall, but it would not surrender. The first real test came in the skies. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe began with probing attacks against British shipping and coastal targets. In August, The focus shifted toward RAF airfields and aircraft factories. The Battle of Britain had begun. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, believed victory would come quickly. He was confident he could destroy the RAF in 4 days, shatter British morale in 4 weeks, and clear the way for invasion. The pilots of RAF Fighter Command were outnumbered nearly 3-1. Many were barely 20 years old. They flew Hurricanes and Spitfires, launching 4, 5, sometimes 6 sorties in a single day. They took off, climbed to 20,000 feet, fought for their lives against German fighters and bombers, landed, refueled, rearmed, and went straight back into the air. Ground crews worked 18-hour shifts. Pilots fell asleep in their cockpits between missions, too exhausted to walk to the mess. The statistics were unforgiving. Between July and October, Fighter Command lost more than 500 pilots, killed or wounded. Entire squadrons were withdrawn after losing 3/4 of their strength. Replacement pilots arrived with as little as 10 hours of training and were often dead within a week. The Luftwaffe lost over 1,800 aircraft. The RAF lost more than 1,000. Every day the arithmetic grew worse. Every day the RAF continued to fly. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. Instead of striking airfields, they would bomb London itself, seeking to break civilian morale and force surrender. That first night, 300 bombers dropped 300 tons of high explosives and thousands of incendiaries on the East End. The docks burned. Warehouses filled with rum, sugar, paint, and timber fueled massive fires visible 50 miles away. 430 civilians were killed. 1,600 were seriously injured. When dawn arrived, the fires were still burning. The bombers returned the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. For 57 consecutive nights, London was attacked. Air raid sirens sounded at dusk. Families gathered their children and their few valuables and descended into underground stations, basement shelters, and coal cellars. They lay in the darkness, listening to the scream of falling bombs, the crash of explosions, the collapse of buildings. When the all-clear sounded at dawn, they emerged to see whether their homes still existed. London was not alone. Coventry was struck by 500 bombers in a single night. Its medieval city center was destroyed. The cathedral was reduced to a hollow shell. Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Belfast, Plymouth, Southampton, all were hammered. Over 8 months, the Luftwaffe dropped more than 40,000 tons of bombs on Britain. More than 43,000 civilians were killed. Over 1 million homes were damaged or destroyed. The British people did not demand surrender. Instead, they adapted. A grim routine took shape. Sleep in the shelters. Emerge at dawn. Check if your house still stood. Go to work if you could get there. Queue for rations. Avoid unexploded bombs marked by red flags. Do not stare at the bombed-out buildings, the gaps in familiar streets like missing teeth. Keep calm and carry on was not just a slogan. It was survival. Women filled roles across society, working in munitions factories, on farms with the Land Army, and in auxiliary services. They drove ambulances through burning streets, pulled survivors from rubble, staffed anti-aircraft batteries, plotted aircraft movements on operations maps, and flew transport planes to free male pilots for combat. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the Women's Royal Naval Service, and the Auxiliary Territorial Service expanded rapidly. By 1943, more than 400,000 women would be serving in uniform. Rationing was severe. Meat, butter, sugar, tea, eggs, and cheese were all rationed from early 1940. Clothing followed in 1941. The average adult's weekly ration included 4 ounces of bacon, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of tea, 8 ounces of sugar, and perhaps 1 fresh egg, if supplies allowed. Bananas disappeared entirely. Oranges became rare luxuries. The Ministry of Food promoted recipes such as Woolton pie, a vegetable dish named after the Minister of Food himself, heavy on turnips and potatoes, light on flavor. People lost weight. The average British civilian lost between 10 and 15 pounds during the war, not from starvation, but from a diet that provided just enough calories to function, nothing more. Clothing wore out and could not be replaced. Coats were turned inside out and resewn. Parachute silk was prized for making underwear. Women drew lines up the backs of their bare legs with eyebrow pencils to imitate stockings they could no longer buy. Through all of this, Britain continued to fight. In North Africa, British and Commonwealth forces battled Italian armies across Libya and Egypt. In 1940, a British offensive drove the Italians back nearly 500 miles, capturing 130,000 prisoners. Then German forces arrived under Erwin Rommel, and the Desert War turned into a brutal cycle of advances and retreats across the same barren terrain. Tobruk was besieged. Benghazi changed hands 4 times. Tank battles raged across the desert in heat that made metal too hot to touch. At sea, the Royal Navy struggled to keep Atlantic supply lines open. German U-boats sank more than 3 million tons of Allied shipping in 1941 alone. Convoys crossed the oceans under constant threat. Merchant sailors knew that a single torpedo could send them into freezing water with only minutes to live. The Navy fought in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Arctic, and the Indian Ocean. Ships were lost. Thousands of sailors died, burned by oil or drowned in the dark. In the Yazidats, Air Bomber Command began striking back at Germany. The early raids were small, inaccurate, and costly. Crews navigated by dead reckoning and moonlight, dropped bombs somewhere near the target if they could find it, and hoped to make it home. Losses ran at 5%, sometimes 10 or more. They kept flying because it was the only way to carry the war onto German soil. Britain was not winning in 1940 or 1941. It was surviving, trading space for time, losses for experience, hoping that eventually the balance would shift. Across the Atlantic, America watched with a mixture of admiration and doubt. President Roosevelt wanted to help. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941, allowed America to supply Britain with weapons and materials without immediate payment. Thousands of aircraft, tanks, trucks, and tons of food crossed the ocean. It was assistance, not alliance. America remained neutral, divided over whether Europe's war was America's problem. Many American military officers questioned Britain's chances. They saw defeats in France, Greece, Crete, and the early disasters in North Africa. They saw an overstretched empire, an army stripped of equipment, and a nation clearly struggling. Some respected British determination, others viewed it as stubborn refusal to face reality. Then came Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Japan's surprise attack brought America into the war overnight. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. Suddenly, Britain had an ally whose industrial power dwarfed Germany's, resources that seemed limitless, manpower that would eventually number in the millions. But American forces were not ready. In December 1941, the U.S. Army numbered fewer than 2 million men, most of them poorly trained and equipped. Building a force capable of invading Europe would take years. In the meantime, American generals and staff officers began arriving in Britain to plan the long road ahead. They arrived expecting to find a nation on its knees, grateful for rescue. What they found was very different. General George Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, visited Britain in April 1942. He toured bombed cities, inspected bases, and met with British commanders. He was struck by the absence of defeatism. These were people who had endured months of bombing, lost sons and husbands, and lived on rations that would have caused unrest in America. They were not beaten. They were angry, determined, and deeply tired of fighting alone. Marshall met Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff. Brooke had commanded the rear guard at Dunkirk, overseen Britain's defense during the invasion scare, and wrestled with impossible strategic dilemmas for 2 years. He was brilliant, sharp, and not inclined to defer to American generals who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The meeting was polite, but tense. Marshall pressed for an immediate invasion of France in 1942. Brooke considered the idea reckless and certain to end in disaster, believing Britain had earned the right to shape strategy. Eisenhower arrived in June to command American forces in the European theater. His headquarters in London occupied a building in Grosvenor Square that had been bombed and repaired. His first impressions, recorded in letters and later memoirs, reveal a man confronting the gap between expectation and reality. He had expected war weariness. He found resilience. He had anticipated desperation. He encountered competence. He thought he would be leading a junior partner. Instead, he found an ally hardened by 3 years of war, shaped by loss, and full of strong opinions about how the conflict should be fought. Eisenhower often walked through London in the evenings, despite the concerns of his security detail. The evidence of bombing was everywhere. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble. Buildings stood, with their fronts blown away, exposing rooms like open dollhouses. Churches were left as shells, their roofs gone, open to the sky. People lived among the ruins, families camping inside partially destroyed houses, cooking on makeshift stoves, hanging laundry between broken walls. He toured factories running around the clock, producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. He visited RAF bases where pilots and crews flew missions over occupied Europe every night. He observed British Army units training for the eventual invasion. Everywhere he went, he saw the same thing: people thin, exhausted, and completely unwilling to give in. One visit remained fixed in his memory. In the Midlands, Eisenhower toured a factory that had been bombed twice. Its roof was patched with corrugated metal, windows were blown out and covered with canvas. The machinery was old, some of it damaged and repaired, yet running constantly. The workforce, mostly women, produced tank components on 3 shifts. 24 hours a day? Eisenhower asked the factory manager about morale. The man looked at him with surprise. "Morale, sir? We're winning, aren't we? We're still here. Jerry's not." That sentence captured the British outlook. Survival itself counted as victory. General Carl Spaatz, who would command U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, arrived and began working closely with RAF Bomber Command. He was impressed and alarmed in equal measure. Impressed by professionalism, courage, and determination. Alarmed by the scale of the losses. Bomber Command was losing roughly 5% of its aircraft on every mission. Crews faced only a 30% chance of surviving a full 30-mission tour. They flew regardless. Spaatz met Lancaster crews who had flown 20 or more missions. Most were in their early 20s but looked far older. They joked about survival odds and spoke quietly about friends lost over the Ruhr, Hamburg, and Berlin. They described flak that could tear, an aircraft apart, night fighters emerging from darkness with cannons firing, and limping home on 2 engines with systems shot out. Then they went back up the following night. American airmen arriving in late 1942 and early 1943 received a harsh education in sustained warfare. The RAF taught them navigation, formation flying, combat tactics, and survival techniques. Every lesson had been paid for in British blood. Each procedure existed because someone had learned it the hard way, or died learning it. Omar Bradley arrived to help plan the invasion of North Africa. He visited British units that had fought Rommel and spoke with officers hardened by the Desert War. He was struck by their calm, practical attitude toward victory and defeat. They had advanced and retreated, won battles and lost them, and learned that war was not about single decisive moments, but about endurance adaptation, and refusing to break. Bradley later wrote that American forces had much to learn from the British about the unglamorous business of staying alive. The British had learned to dig proper foxholes, camouflage positions, maintain equipment in harsh conditions, move at night, and recognize the sounds of different aircraft and artillery. They had learned these things because the alternative was death. Not every American reaction was admiring. George Patton, who arrived in 1942 to help plan the North Africa campaign, had a complicated relationship with the British. He respected their courage but found them overly cautious, too deliberate, and too focused on consolidation. His diary entries show grudging respect mixed with frustration. He wrote about officers who had been fighting for 3 years and were worn down. He criticized tactics that prioritized preserving strength over taking risks. Patton did not fully appreciate that Britain could not afford the losses America could replace. For Britain, preserving force was not timidity, it was survival. Even so, Patton recognized what Britain had endured. He visited Coventry and walked through the destroyed city center. He stood in the ruined cathedral, its walls intact but roof gone, open to the sky. That night, he wrote in his diary that any nation that could suffer this and continue fighting deserved respect. Respect developed slowly on both sides. British civilians and soldiers had mixed feelings about the Americans arriving in 1942 and 1943. The phrase overpaid, oversexed, and overhere became common. Half resentment, half humor. American soldiers were paid far more and had access to luxuries, cigarettes, chocolate, nylon stockings, that had disappeared from British shops years earlier. They were confident, sometimes arrogantly so, about winning a war Britain had been fighting for 3 years. Yet the British also understood that American entry meant eventual victory. The industrial power, the resources, the sheer scale of American mobilization meant Germany would ultimately be overwhelmed. The Americans were inexperienced, yes, but they were here. And that changed everything. The relationship between British and American commanders was complex, often tense, sometimes strained, but ultimately effective. Eisenhower proved to be as skilled a diplomat as he was a soldier. He understood that coalition warfare demanded compromise, that British experience and American strength had to be fused, and that personal relationships mattered as much as strategy. He worked closely with British commanders, particularly General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery was prickly, supremely confident, cautious, and entirely professional. He had taken command of the 8th Army in North Africa when it was reeling from defeat and transformed it into a force capable of winning. He planned meticulously, built up overwhelming strength, and attacked only when he believed success was certain. This method drove Patton to distraction. Eisenhower learned to balance Montgomery's careful approach with Patton's aggressive instincts, using each where they were most effective. The first major test of the Anglo-American alliance came in November 1942 with Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa. It was a compromise strategy. The Americans wanted to invade France immediately. The British argued that such an attempt would fail catastrophically and that North Africa was achievable and strategically sound. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed on North Africa. The operation was far from smooth. American forces, entering large-scale combat for the first time, made serious mistakes. They were outfought by German units in Tunisia. They learned, painfully, that training and real combat were very different things. British forces, veterans of the Desert War, provided experience and stability that kept the campaign moving forward. By May 1943, North Africa was secured. German and Italian forces surrendered. More than 250,000 prisoners were taken. It was a genuine, Allied victory. American and British forces had learned to fight together. They had learned coordination, compromise, and trust. The alliance had begun to harden. During this period, more American generals arrived in Britain and continued to be struck by what they encountered. James Doolittle, who had led the famous raid on Tokyo in April 1942, arrived to take command of the 8th Air Force in Europe. He visited RAF bases, spoke with British air crews, and studied their tactics and losses. He was shaken by the casualty rates. He met pilots who had flown 30 or 40 missions, far beyond what American doctrine considered survivable. They spoke calmly about odds, luck, and the goal of making it through just one more mission. Doolittle introduced changes shaped by British experience: better fighter escorts for bombers, revised formations, and new tactics for countering German fighters. These lessons had been purchased with British blood, and American airmen would benefit from that. Sacrifice. In the build-up to D-Day, more than 1.5 million American servicemen passed through Britain. They trained on British bases, in British fields and countryside, alongside British units. They saw bomb damage in every city. They met British families who had lost sons, husbands, and fathers. They attended dances in village halls, drank in pubs that had been serving beer since before America existed, and lived among a people who had been at war for nearly 5 years. Gradually, many American soldiers came to understand what Britain had endured. They saw the ration books, the worn clothing, the exhaustion etched into faces. They saw people who had been bombed, deprived, and bereaved, yet who had never stopped fighting. General Marshall, returning to Britain in 1943, noticed the change in attitude. Early skepticism had given way to respect. American officers who had worked alongside British counterparts recognized their professionalism, experience, and determination. The alliance was working, not perfectly, but well enough. Churchill and Roosevelt met repeatedly throughout the war, building the personal relationship that underpinned the alliance. Churchill brought experience. Roosevelt brought resources. They argued over strategy, timing, and post-war plans, but they shared an unbreakable commitment to defeating Germany and Japan, and they made the partnership work. That mutual respect was perhaps most clearly demonstrated in the planning for D-Day. Eisenhower served as Supreme Commander, but his deputy, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, was British. Montgomery commanded all ground forces for the initial assault, both American and British. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, British, commanded the naval forces. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, British, commanded the air forces. It was a truly integrated command structure. On June 6, 1944, more than 150,000 Allied troops, American, British, and Canadian, landed in Normandy on the first day alone. The invasion succeeded because of that integration, because American industrial power and manpower combined with British experience and endurance into something greater than either alone. By that point, Britain had been at war for nearly 5 years. The nation was exhausted, stretched close to breaking, yet still fighting. American generals who had arrived in 1942 skeptical of British capabilities now understood what Britain had accomplished. They had seen a nation that had stood alone when standing alone seemed suicidal. Eisenhower later reflected on this in his memoirs. He wrote of British resilience, of determination, of courage shown not only by soldiers, but by civilians. Women working in factories, children evacuated to the countryside, families living in bomb shelters. America, he wrote, entered the war confident in its strength. Britain taught them about endurance. The phrase "never quit" became shorthand for British determination. It was not entirely perfect. There were moments of despair, doubt, and exhaustion so deep it seemed impossible to continue. Yet day after day, the nation made the collective decision to keep fighting. Not because victory was assured, especially in the dark months of 1940 and 1941, but because the alternative was unacceptable. American generals learned that courage was not only charging forward under fire, it was also standing still beneath bombardment. It was working 12-hour shifts on near-starvation rations. It was sending children away for safety and not knowing if they would ever return. It was living in a city reduced to rubble and going to work the next morning. The Allied victory in Europe rested on many pillars: American industrial might, American manpower, and Soviet sacrifice. But Britain's refusal to quit during those 2 years of fighting alone provided something equally essential. It proved that Nazi Germany could be resisted, that Hitler could be defied, and that even in the darkest hour, surrender was not inevitable. Those bombed cities, thin faces, worn clothing, ration books, and crushing exhaustion testified to a single truth. Britain had looked into the abyss and decided not to fall. It stood on the edge, battered, frightened, and precarious, and held until help arrived. Help did arrive, in the form of American power and Soviet sacrifice. Together, the Allies won the war. But in those 2 years of fighting alone, Britain won something else, something perhaps more important. It earned the right to say it had never quit, never surrendered, and never stopped fighting. When American generals wrote in their letters, memoirs, and official reports about what they had seen in Britain, they were not offering empty praise. They were recognizing something profound. They were acknowledging a nation that had held the line when no one else could or would, a people who absorbed everything Nazi Germany could throw at them and remained standing. That determination, combined later with American strength, made victory possible. Not just tanks, planes, and ships, but the shared understanding that some things were worth any sacrifice. Britain proved that truth first, alone. Together, the Allies ensured it survived.